families. In the midst of this festive period, I just wanted to ask you to join me today in finding a special place in your hearts and your minds and prayers for the hundreds of thousands of people across.
The following morning, Sandringham's corridors carried a silence that felt heavier than the night before. It was the kind of quiet that only follows irreversible decisions. Staff moved carefully, eyes lowered, footsteps softened, as if the house itself had learned to hold its breath. Something fundamental had shifted, and everyone felt it, even if no one spoke it aloud. King Charles sat alone in his study. The final audit file was closed, resting on the edge of his desk, but its presence dominated the room. These were not just figures or transfers, they were years of trust, unspoken compromises, and assumptions he had never believed needed questioning. For the first time since ascending the throne, the crown felt less like a legacy and more like a burden carried in solitude. By midday, select members of the Privy Council had been quietly briefed. There was no announcement, no dramatic statement, only a controlled signal sent through carefully chosen channels. The message was deliberate and unmistakable. The crown had audited itself. Financial task forces froze accounts, sealed charitable ledgers, and suspended discretionary authority across multiple offices. Money that had moved unseen for years was now firmly grounded. For Prince William, this was not a moment of triumph. It was the weight of responsibility settling fully onto his shoulders. His instructions to his team were precise and restrained. No spectacle, no revenge, no leaks designed for humiliation. This was about cleaning the system so thoroughly that it would never need cleaning again. Queen Camilla remained out of public view, confined to a separate wing of the estate. Her schedule was cleared. Calls went unanswered. For the first time, oversight replaced autonomy. It was not imprisonment, but it was no longer freedom. Every decision now passed through someone else's hands. Beyond the palace walls, the effects rippled quickly. Royal-linked foundations began restructuring. Advisors quietly removed offshore jurisdictions from internal documents. Commonwealth capitals received briefings that changed the tone of future engagements. The signal was clear. This monarchy was no longer content to be symbolic. It was becoming procedural. Then came Christmas. The Sandringham walk went ahead as planned. Cameras captured polite smiles and measured waves, but something was unmistakably different. Observers noticed the distance between the king and queen, small in appearance, vast in meaning. It was not physical separation, it was the space created by choices that cannot be undone. That evening, after the guests had gone, the king summoned William to the study. There was no anger, no lecture, no regret voiced aloud, only a quiet acknowledgement. "What you did was right," Charles reportedly said, "but it comes at a cost." William did not argue. He simply replied that survival has always demanded payment, and integrity is never free. In the first week of 2026, a revised sovereign grant framework was approved without fanfare. Fewer staff, reduced privileges, expanded reporting requirements. For the first time, detailed financial disclosures appeared on official channels, not as summaries, but as verifiable records. This was not reform for optics, it was a new contract between the crown and the public. And within all of it, one truth became impossible to ignore. The monarchy was no longer resting on personal loyalty or inherited silence. It had transformed into a system, one where accountability comes before allegiance and truth stands above tradition. The House of Windsor was no longer what it had been, but perhaps for the first time it had become what it had always claimed to be. As night settled once more over Sandringham, one certainty remained. In this house, there would be no return to shadows, only scrutiny, only records, only the audit, enduring, unblinking, and final. In the days that followed, the palace entered a phase no one had planned for, yet everyone sensed was inevitable. It was not chaos, it was something colder than that. Systems were being rewritten in real time, habits dismantled without ceremony, authority redistributed with surgical precision. The monarchy had not stumbled into reform, it had been forced into it, and it was adapting with ruthless speed. Internal reviews expanded beyond finance. Patronage boards were reconstituted. Advisory roles that had once been honorary became conditional. Legacy appointments, some untouched for decades, were quietly dissolved. The language inside the palace changed as well. Words like custom and precedent gave way to risk and exposure. Tradition was no longer a shield, it was a variable. King Charles watched these changes with a restraint that surprised even those closest to him. He did not interfere, he did not slow the process. Instead, he observed it with the posture of a man who understood that stopping now would undo everything. Those who mistook his silence for weakness misunderstood the moment entirely. This was not abdication of control, it was consent to transformation. Behind closed doors, however, the cost began to surface. Private letters arrived from old allies, figures who had stood beside the crown for generations, now unsettled by the sudden transparency. Some warned that too much exposure would invite scrutiny the institution could not survive. Others cautioned that William's approach risked alienating the very networks that had protected the monarchy in its most fragile years. The king read every word. He responded to none. William, meanwhile, was no longer operating as an heir-in-waiting. He was acting as a head of state in all but name. His days began before sunrise and ended long after midnight. Briefings replaced ceremonies. Data replaced deference. Where others once relied on discretion, he demanded documentation. Where ambiguity had been tolerated, he insisted on clarity. This shift unsettled more than a few within the royal orbit. Certain households, long accustomed to autonomy, found themselves under review. Expenses once waved through without question were returned with annotations. Requests for funding were paused, then declined, then reopened under new conditions. It became clear that nothing would move unless it could be defended in daylight. And then there was the matter no one could fully ignore, Camilla's position. She remained visible in limited capacity, attending only the engagements deemed essential. Her presence was formal, restrained, carefully managed. Gone was the informal influence she once wielded behind the scenes. Advisors who had once reported directly to her were reassigned. Access narrowed. Information slowed. What the public did not see was the internal reckoning. For the first time since joining the institution, Camilla existed without leverage. Every role she held was now contingent, every privilege conditional. The transition was not announced, but it was unmistakable. The Queen Consort had become a figure without operational authority, her power replaced by protocols she could not bend. Some within the palace sympathized, others felt vindicated, but none questioned the finality of the shift. Across the Atlantic, attention sharpened. Diplomatic channels began asking questions, not accusatory but precise. Financial compliance units requested confirmations. Legal teams reviewed past engagements with renewed caution. The palace responded with cooperation that bordered on overcorrection. Documents were shared, audits opened, silence was replaced with data. It was this openness that altered the narrative. What might have become a scandal instead evolved into a case study. Analysts began describing the monarchy not as embattled, but recalibrated. Editorials noted that while the institution had suffered internal fracture, it had gained external credibility. Transparency, once feared as a threat, had become its strongest defense. Yet inside Sandringham, credibility did little to soften the personal fallout. Charles and Camilla's private interactions became infrequent, carefully structured, and devoid of intimacy. Conversations that once flowed easily now ended quickly. There were no confrontations left to have. Everything that could be said had already been documented. For Charles, the realization was slow but devastating. The role he had waited a lifetime to fulfill had required him to sacrifice the one partnership he believed would sustain him within it. History would likely praise his decision, but history would not sit with him at night. William understood this more than he let on. In quieter moments, he questioned whether the path he had chosen could ever lead back to something resembling normalcy. He had saved the institution, yes, but in doing so, he had hardened it. The crown would endure, but it would no longer be gentle, and perhaps that was the point. As winter deepened, a new initiative quietly emerged from William's office. It was not framed as reform, but as modernization. All royal assets, land, trusts, patronages, endowments, were mapped into a single oversight framework. No exceptions, no informal exemptions. The monarchy's entire economic footprint would now exist within one auditable structure. The implications were profound. For the first time in centuries, the crown could no longer rely on obscurity as insulation. Every asset would have a rationale, every expense a justification, every benefit a corresponding obligation. This move sent shockwaves through aristocratic circles. Families long intertwined with royal finance began reassessing their positions. Some divested voluntarily, others withdrew entirely. A few attempted resistance, but found no audience for it. The era of negotiated opacity was over. What replaced it was something far more rigid and far more stable. Public trust began to shift. Polling data showed a subtle but consistent change. Younger demographics, historically skeptical of the monarchy, began viewing it less as an inherited relic and more as a constitutional entity evolving with the times. Critics remained, but their arguments softened. It became harder to dismiss an institution that willingly subjected itself to scrutiny others avoided. By early spring, the narrative had fully turned. The story was no longer about hidden accounts or internal rupture. It was about consequence, about a system that had chosen exposure over denial, about an heir who had acted not to inherit power, but to restrain it. Fatigue from a busy schedule. But inside Kensington Palace, the staff knew better. One October evening, a senior advisor found William still working at nearly midnight, surrounded by papers related to constitutional matters, charity briefings, and family medical updates. When gently asked if he needed anything, William simply shook his head and kept reading. The advisor left deeply unsettled, recognizing the signs of someone running on empty but unable to stop. Catherine, recovering but still fragile, began noticing changes too. Her husband, normally present and engaged at home, seemed increasingly absent even when physically there. His mind was always somewhere else, always planning, always worrying, always trying to hold together the multiple fracturing pieces of their lives. The breaking point began forming in early November, though no single moment caused it. Instead, it was the accumulation, the months of being strong for Catherine, the constitutional weight of supporting his father, the parental responsibility of protecting 3 children through crisis, the institutional pressure of representing a monarchy under intense global scrutiny, the personal grief of watching his wife fight cancer while keeping his own fear hidden. By mid-November, those closest to William began using a word they had avoided for months: unsustainable. Anne said it first during a family meeting. Camilla echoed it days later. Even Charles, still recovering himself, finally acknowledged what everyone else had been too afraid to voice. William was carrying too much for too long with too little support. The final straw came in late November during what should have been a routine briefing. William sat through an hour-long discussion about next year's engagements, listening to plans that assumed his limitless availability, his endless capacity, his permanent strength. When the meeting ended, he stood, walked to the window, and for the first time in anyone's memory, admitted out loud that he didn't know how much longer he could continue at this pace. It was that admission, quiet and devastating, that set in motion the events leading to December 21st. Because once William finally acknowledged his struggle, the people who loved him realized they could no longer stand by and watch him break. When the palace could no longer look away, the turning point came not in a grand confrontation, but in a series of quiet observations that accumulated until they could no longer be ignored. Princess Anne, with her decades of experience reading the subtle shifts in royal dynamics, was the first to formalize her concerns. It happened during a cold morning in early December at Windsor Castle, in one of the smaller private drawing rooms where sensitive family matters were traditionally discussed, away from staff ears. Anne had requested the meeting with Charles, and her tone left no room for the usual deflections. She arrived carrying a folder, unusual for someone who typically relied on memory and instinct. Inside were notes from conversations with Kensington Palace staff, observations from recent family gatherings, and a timeline showing William's schedule over the past 6 months. The document painted a picture that was impossible to dismiss. "He's functioning," Anne said, setting the folder on the table between them, "but he's not well. There's a difference, and we've been pretending not to see it." Her voice carried the particular firmness she reserved for moments when protocol needed to be set aside for truth. Charles, seated across from her with his own fatigue visible in the lines around his eyes, didn't immediately respond. He knew what was coming. Anne continued, methodical and unyielding. She described the weight William had been carrying since January: Catherine's surgery and subsequent cancer diagnosis, the children's emotional needs during their mother's treatment, the constitutional responsibilities he'd absorbed when Charles stepped back for his own health crisis, the public engagements he'd maintained without pause, the careful management of media narratives around both Catherine's and Charles's conditions, the private worry he carried but never voiced. "He's 30 pieces of himself," Anne said quietly, "and none of them whole." It was the kind of observation only someone who had survived decades of royal pressure could make. Anne understood what it meant to fracture under duty's weight while maintaining a flawless public facade. She had lived it herself during darker years of her own life. Charles listened, his hands folded tightly. As a father, he felt the sharp sting of guilt. As a king, he understood the impossible position they'd all played a part in creating. The monarchy needed William functional. The institution depended on his steadiness, especially now with both Charles and Catherine dealing with health crises. But Anne was right. They had been asking the impossible and calling it duty. The conversation grew heavier as Anne detailed specific incidents. A moment in late November when William had excused himself from a family dinner, only to be found 20 minutes later standing alone in a dark corridor, staring at nothing. The increasing frequency with which he worked past midnight, as though stopping would allow everything he was holding to collapse. The way his responses during meetings had become shorter, more mechanical, as if he was operating on autopilot. Queen Camilla joined the discussion later that morning, bringing her own perspective shaped by years of navigating public scrutiny and private pain. She had watched William transform. William's reputation hardened into something precise, not charismatic, not warm, but dependable. Within the palace, a phrase began circulating quietly among senior staff: "Nothing moves without a ledger." It was not meant as a joke. Charles, for his part, began redefining his reign in quieter ways. Freed from the burden of managing what he no longer controlled, he leaned into symbolism with renewed focus. Environmental initiatives, interfaith dialogue, cultural preservation, areas where moral authority mattered more than operational power. In this division of roles, the monarchy found balance. The king would embody continuity, the Prince of Wales would enforce structure, and Camilla would remain, present but peripheral. There were moments when the old rhythms tried to return: a shared glance during a public appearance, a familiar routine resumed briefly, but the underlying reality always reasserted itself. Trust, once fractured at an institutional level, does not repair itself privately. As summer approached, one final decision was made. The palace authorized the release of a comprehensive transparency charter, outlining not just current reforms, but permanent constraints on royal finance. It bound future monarchs, heirs, and consorts alike, no exceptions based on marriage, no carve-outs based on tradition. It was, in effect, a constitutional self-limitation. Charles signed it without hesitation. When asked privately whether he regretted the path that had led here, his answer was measured. He said only that crowns endure not because they are protected, but because they are corrected. The monarchy had survived scandals before, but it had never survived an audit like this, and perhaps that was why it would survive this one. As the year moved forward, the institution settled into its new form, leaner, sharper, less forgiving, but more honest. The shadows that once clung to its corridors had nowhere left to hide. The crown remained, the duty continued, but the era of unexamined privilege had closed forever. By late summer, the monarchy had settled into something unfamiliar yet unmistakably deliberate. The chaos many had predicted never arrived. There were no leaks of panic, no sudden resignations, no public fractures. Instead, there was discipline, quiet, relentless, and absolute. The palace had learned how to move differently. What changed first was not policy, but behavior. Staff no longer assumed approval. Every request, travel, security, staffing, funding, came with documentation, justification, and a digital trail that could not be erased. Senior courtiers who had built entire careers on discretion struggled to adapt. Some retired early, others faded into irrelevance. A few attempted to test the boundaries, only to discover there were none left to push. The institution had hardened. Prince William's inner circle expanded carefully, not by loyalty but by competence. Financial analysts replaced traditional advisors. Compliance officers sat where personal secretaries once had. Even language shifted. Meetings were no longer about optics or balance, but about exposure, risk thresholds, and long-term institutional resilience. It was not glamorous, it was not warm, but it worked. For the first time, the monarchy functioned like a modern state entity rather than a protected dynasty, and the world noticed. Foreign governments adjusted their approach. Invitations once framed around symbolism were now structured around accountability. Joint initiatives demanded transparency clauses. The crown was no longer treated as an untouchable cultural artifact, it was treated as a partner with rules. This, paradoxically, increased its relevance. Domestically, the change was slower but deeper. Universities began studying the Windsor model as a case of institutional self-correction. Media narratives softened, not out of sympathy but out of respect for restraint. Even critics acknowledged that the palace had done something rare. It had chosen reform before being forced into it publicly. Yet inside the walls of Sandringham and Buckingham Palace, the emotional toll continued to surface in quieter ways. King Charles grew visibly thinner, not from illness, but from the weight of adaptation. He fulfilled his duties with precision, but those closest to him noticed the absence of ease. The joy he once found in preparation and discussion had been replaced by efficiency. His reign had become less about shaping the future and more about stabilizing the present. In private moments, he revisited old letters, old notes, remnants of a life built on trust rather than verification. The realization that trust had become a liability, not a virtue, cut deeper than any scandal could have. Camilla's world continued to contract. She was no longer consulted on strategy, no longer briefed ahead of decisions. Invitations arrived later. Information arrived filtered. Where she once anticipated events, she now reacted to them. The change was subtle but absolute. There was no public humiliation, no formal demotion, just absence. The most difficult adjustment was not the loss of power, but the loss of certainty. She could no longer predict outcomes, no longer influence trajectories. She had become a figure within a system that no longer needed her instincts. For someone who had survived decades by navigating shadows, this was the cruelest outcome of all. William remained distant but not cruel. He did not seek confrontation. He did not seek reconciliation either. His approach was colder than anger. He simply removed variables. To him, the past no longer mattered, only containment. As autumn approached, one final internal review surfaced an unexpected consequence of the reforms. The palace discovered that entire layers of informal authority had existed without documentation, agreements, understandings, long-standing assumptions that had never been written down because they were never meant to be examined. These were not illegal, but they were indefensible. William ordered them dismantled anyway. This decision marked the final death of the old system. No more gentlemen's agreements, no more quiet accommodations, no more reliance on personal discretion. Everything would exist on paper or not at all. The backlash was muted but real. Certain aristocratic families withdrew their support. Some philanthropic partnerships dissolved. A handful of long-standing benefactors stepped away quietly, unwilling to operate under scrutiny. William accepted the losses without hesitation. Stability, he believed, did not come from loyalty, it came from structure. Public perception continued to evolve. The monarchy became less romantic, less theatrical, but more credible. It no longer asked to be loved, it asked to be trusted. And trust, for the first time in decades, began to grow. As the year drew closer to its end, the palace released a forward-looking financial outlook, something previously unthinkable. It included projections, risk assessments, and contingency planning for succession scenarios. Included in that document was a sentence that quietly redefined the institution's future. All consorts, present and future, are subject to the same financial governance standards as the sovereign. There would be no exceptions again. Charles read the final draft alone. He signed it without amendment. That night he walked the grounds of Sandringham by himself. No aides, no security within sight. Just the sound of gravel underfoot and the weight of a crown that no longer allowed illusion. He understood fully now that the monarchy he inherited was not the one he would pass on, and that, perhaps, was the point. William, watching the transition from a distance, knew his own future had been irrevocably shaped. He would not inherit a warm institution, but he would inherit a survivable one. The price had been steep, the cost had been personal, but the outcome was undeniable. The crown had not collapsed under scrutiny, it had evolved through it, and in doing so it had rewritten the unspoken rule that once governed royal life. Silence is no longer protection, transparency is. As winter approached once more, the monarchy stood quieter than ever, but not weaker. Leaner, sharper, and stripped of illusion, it had entered a new phase of existence. No longer a house of secrets, no longer a house of shadows, just a system, visible, accountable, and finally honest enough to endure. Winter returned quietly, not with spectacle, but with routine, and that with how the palace knew the transformation had taken hold. Crisis no longer dictated movement, systems did. Decisions arrived on schedule, not in response to pressure, but because the machinery now demanded them. One of the most subtle yet profound changes emerged in how succession itself was discussed. For the first time, planning documents treated transition not as an event, but as a process. Contingency models were drafted years in advance, outlining authority transfers, financial safeguards, and interim governance mechanisms that left nothing to improvisation. The crown was no longer trusting fate, it was planning for it. William insisted on this shift personally. He had learned that uncertainty was where power hid. Eliminate uncertainty, and power either justified itself or disappeared. The monarchy, stripped of mystery, was becoming something closer to a constitutional organism than a family legacy. Inside the palace, a new generation of staff began to rise. They had no nostalgia for the old ways, no reverence for unwritten rules. They had been hired for one reason alone: competence under scrutiny. Their loyalty was not to individuals, but to frameworks. It made them efficient and quietly dangerous to anyone still hoping for discretion. This generational shift created friction. Senior figures who had survived multiple reigns found themselves sidelined, not by dismissal, but by redundancy. Their knowledge of how things used to work no longer applied. They became advisors without influence, historians of a system that had moved past them. The monarchy did not mourn their departure, it absorbed it. Public engagement changed as well. Royal appearances became fewer but more deliberate. Each event carried measurable outcomes: funding commitments, policy alignment, institutional partnerships. Symbolism was no longer enough. Presence had to produce value. Critics noticed the difference. So did supporters. The crown's approval ratings stabilized, not soaring, but steady. For an institution once defined by volatility, this was a victory. Stability meant survival. Behind the scenes, William authorized a final, controversial measure: the permanent separation of ceremonial image and operational authority. From that point forward, no royal figure would control both. Visibility and power would no longer coexist in the same hands. It was a preventative strike. Ceremonial roles expanded in grace, but narrowed in influence. Operational roles became invisible, but absolute. The monarchy, once a blur of performance and control, split into two distinct functions. It was cleaner, safer, less human. Charles accepted this division with unexpected calm. He had come to understand that what he represented mattered more than what he controlled. In relinquishing operational dominance, he preserved moral authority, the one currency no audit could measure. Camilla adapted in her own way. Deprived of leverage, she retreated into formality. Publicly, she fulfilled her duties with composure. Privately, she withdrew from the rhythms of decision-making. There were no attempts to reclaim influence, no visible resentment, only a quiet recalibration of expectations. Those who assumed she would resist misunderstood her entirely. Survival had always been her greatest skill. This was simply a new environment. What surprised many was that she remained, not because she was indispensable, but because removing her would have required emotion, and emotion was no longer how this monarchy operated. She existed now as part of the architecture, not the